Okay, we are live. Joining me today is a supremely special guest, a wonderful pleasure to have you here today, Victor Caston. So, Victor, I was wondering if you could say a little bit about who you are and what you do for those who might not know you.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Thanks for having me on, Richard. Uh, so I'm a professor of philosophy and classical studies here at the University of Michigan. I've been for the past 15 years. And most of my research is on ancient Greek and Roman philosophy, in particular the philosophy of mind. And I've concentrated in particular on Aristotle and the Stoics, but I've ranged across the whole period. So from pre-Socratics and Sophists all the way down to late antiquity with Augustine. And the kinds of topics I've been interested in also range a good deal. My sort of most persistent interest has been in intentionality and content, mental representation. But I've also written on mind-body issues, on supervenience and emergence and mental causation, as well as a great deal in recent years has been focused more particularly on perception. Say for the past 10 years or so, I've been focused extensively on that and questions about consciousness and qualia, to the extent we can find any kind of clues about their views about that, higher order theories of consciousness, and so on.
Wow, yeah, that's quite a bit. That's a lot of interesting stuff. So for people like me who have an interest in the ancient philosophers, and I think it's interesting in its own right, but I wonder if you could, what your thoughts are about how useful this might be to modern readers who maybe are looking for something that's useful to their own work. So do you think that someone who's studying like modern philosophy, cognitive science, can benefit from thinking about the ancients, or do you think it's worthwhile?
Absolutely. I mean, I think just like for philosophers, engaging with the history is often very profitable. Sometimes it's a question about finding genuinely new ideas or ideas that have been neglected for a long time.
Yeah.
And so bringing them back and engaging with them can be really very profitable. I mean, so a very obvious example of this is the engagement with virtue ethics in antiquity really was a stimulus, I think, to contemporary discussions and critical discussions. In other cases, I mean, I think I take a very empirical attitude towards this. Sometimes you're going to find new, interesting, or neglected ideas. Other times it's pretty strange or pretty bizarre. You just have to go and see what you can see. I think that in general, one of the benefits is that because it's from a different period and historical context, people have different preoccupations and different blind spots. And so it's, you get kind of a different angle, even when you're dealing with the same problem, because there are different assumptions that are involved. There are different things that get questioned, slightly different approaches. So there's a very nice quotation from Thomas Huxley, who argued about whether animals are automata and things like this in the 19th century, about how the history of the discipline gives us a kind of parallax view of concepts, because we get these different angles on a single subject, and so see it in a fresh way. And I think that it's been useful for expanding our horizons in that way. I mean, just a small example is that if you're looking at Plato and Aristotle, for example, the focus on propositional attitudes is not as prominent as it is in, say, the Hellenistic period, and for good historical reasons. I think that 20th and 21st century philosophy is very influenced by the early modern period. The early modern period is actually very influenced by Hellenistic discussions like the Stoics and the Skeptics, and the way they were sort of rediscovered or appreciated in the Renaissance and afterwards, the rise of early modern science. But if you look at Plato and Aristotle, they're not focused on propositional attitudes. For a long time, that was that was kind of, I don't know about embarrassment, but it was an oddity about dealing with their discussions of the mind. On the other hand, they were focused on non-propositional attitudes
Right.
pretty intently. And I think that's been an important rediscovery for contemporary philosophers to think about the different kinds of objects of different sorts of attitudes, and to be a little bit more open in that way. And there would be other sorts of views as well. I mean, at the same time, there are all sorts of things they're not concerned with. So it's very hard, I've found, to find discussions of qualia, of phenomenal qualities of experience. And that's an interesting thing in its own right, maybe somewhat frustrating, but sort of worthy of attention. There are other cases where things haven't been appreciated, but coming at it from contemporary philosophy shines light where you didn't see it before.
Yeah.
So
I think,
yeah.
no, I was going to say, I completely agree with you. I mean, as for myself, when I was when I first started, I was like, I don't want to read anything that was written before 1980. I want to know about the brain and cognitive science. But then I realized how naive that was. I had some great teachers, obviously. I mentioned one before we started, John Glanville and a couple of others, but who really opened my eyes to the usefulness and importance of going back and reading with modern eyes, but also trying to understand them from the things they were worried about, but also trying to engage in that discussion with them, and to continue that discussion, which they start.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So,
I think that if you look at many of the great figures in Anglophone philosophy, did have that kind of engagement, and did take those discussions that they were having with the ancients as a real stimulus. I mean, you can easily mention people like Gilbert Ryle and J.L.
Right.
Austin and Bernard Williams, and it goes on from there. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something that maybe is a bit lost, or underemphasized in our modern philosophical culture, because there's so much emphasis on specialization and compartmentalization. And I think maybe kind of the post-positivism hangover that we have, where there was this emphasis on small questions, and not as much emphasis on the big questions and these overarching dialogues that we may have.
Specialization has been an issue. I think that there was other kinds of hostility to history of philosophy in the past. I think certainly during our graduate training and all. For me, my memory of the 80s and the 90s was that there was a real division, and people really thought that history was really something separate from philosophy. But there were historians who also thought of themselves as doing something distinct. But I think actually I've been very encouraged by the last 10 to 15 years, because I think that people have broader interests now and are a little bit more open to discussions across boundaries. And so it's been, I found it much more stimulating.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I think there's been a change. I mean, not just as an anecdote. I remember in grad school, I came to a class on philosophy of causation, and I mentioned Aristotle, and the teacher was very taken aback, and was like, "Oh, you're into Aristotle?" It's like, yeah, because there's an attitude like philosophy starts with Frege basically, and then we'll move on from there. But it's nice to see that's kind of receding.
I think so.
So I wanted to ask about, just generally speaking, because you mentioned, phenomenal consciousness, qualia, things of that nature. Do you think that the ancient Greeks in particular had a notion of consciousness that connects up with ours? Because some people argue that we didn't really start having this modern notion until after Descartes, at least, the idea of a conscious mental state. Is that something that you do find in the ancients?
Absolutely. I mean, it's hard to imagine how you could not have it. But I think what's interesting is the ways in which it's manifest in the text. So there's certain things that they're quite explicit about, and there are other things that you might get hints of it, but it's not as central. And I think that we have this kind of fixation with Descartes as this pivotal moment, which I think is really, it's understandable why we do that, but I think it's quite mistaken and misleading. I think there are many many aspects and many interests in the philosophy of mind that do go back earlier, and it's different for different periods. And it's just worth approaching it with an open mind. So about consciousness, I think that until quite recently, people who were reading the ancient texts just projected their own way of thinking about things onto it. So they just assumed that the ancients were talking about phenomenal awareness, that they were talking, for example, about images or about sense data or things like that. And then people became very skeptical of that and just kind of pulled back. There are discussions about these various things. But I guess what I would say is this, is that there's a much clearer emphasis throughout on the intentionality of perception, so on its content, what it is that you're aware of, where that would be things in the outside world for the most part, and also on higher order consciousness. So our being aware or perceiving that we perceive, that we see, that we hear, awareness that we're thinking, and things like that. And so there are throughout the whole period, there are discussions of that. So that I think is a very clear emphasis. What's much harder to find is a fixation on qualia, as I said. I think that's in a way the most elusive subject. I mean, it may have been a concern, but it's not something that gets articulated clearly. And the problems that we associate with qualia, for example, about reduction or mind-body issues, similarly are absent. There are other ones that we identify with Descartes, for example, where there actually is some earlier history. So just to take two, if you think about what Descartes really introduces, especially through the Meditations, to early modern philosophy in terms of subjectivity or privacy in particular. I think many historians of ancient Greek philosophy think that really is a modern concern. It's not to be found in antiquity. And I think that that's clearly, I mean, it's demonstrably false. So you can find elements on both those sorts of issues, certainly in Augustine and in Plotinus. And you can find, I think, many discussions of these issues earlier among skeptics like the Pyrrhonist skeptics like Sextus Empiricus.
Right.
And depending on what you have in mind with privacy, I think those issues actually can be found in classical antiquity, so in the 5th and in the 4th century. So there are worries about privacy and about subjectivity already in the sophists, Protagoras and Gorgias, and then the reactions to them in Plato, for example, and in Aristotle. And you can also throw in Democritus there as well. It's a little bit harder to extract much, but I think it's easily argued that they are touching on those issues.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, that there's so much of what we take to be distinctively modern worries or philosophical puzzles or problems, you can find elements of those even in these early thinkers.
You certainly can. I think there are differences in what preoccupies us, like what we take to be pivotal, and all of our discussions kind of center around it. Those will be different. And I think that as I said, their interest tends more towards issues about content.
Right.
This is I focus on it, and for me, that's actually been a really useful set of questions with which to approach the ancient text, because a lot of preoccupations of historians or other people who are writing on these ancient figures brought their own preoccupations to the table, and so a lot of them had to do with mind-body issues.
Right.
And so that even when they were talking about perception or about thinking, they were focused on these more metaphysical questions than just questions about how does the mind work and how are they thinking of the mind and how do mental states have the content that they do.
Right. And
Um,
that's, you find, I mean, so it's clear, like when you're reading Aristotle, for example, that he's very interested in that set of topics. But even going back to Plato and, like, I think, as you point out, Parmenides as well can be read in this way. But it's not so much clear that they worry about, like, the question of what makes a mental state conscious, or whether, so do they even think in that way in terms of mental states or being conscious or not? Would you say that's a distinctively modern thing?
no, I don't think so at all. I mean, as I said, I mean, if you think that the core issues about consciousness are about the hard problem and about explaining what it's like to have sorts of experiences, or what sorts of qualities of our experiences are immediately evident to us or accessible to us. As I said, I think you find only kind of hints, and you certainly don't have this kind of central fixation with that set of issues, that locus of problems. But if you are interested instead with, say, higher order theories and questions about what makes a given mental state a conscious state, right? And you're thinking in terms of, as higher order theorists do, anybody from David Rosenthal to Franz Brentano, right? Where you think, well, what makes it conscious is that there's another mental state which is directed at it, right? So we're aware of it because we're either perceiving it or thinking about it or making a judgment, however you view it. They absolutely talk about that. And the argument that Aristotle gives, for example, in his On the Soul, or I'm sure I'll slip into using its Latin title, the De Anima.
The infamous 3-2.
The infamous 3-2, right? In book 3, chapter 2, the very beginning of that is a set of arguments about how it is that we perceive, that we see and hear. And one of the arguments is a regress argument, in order to show that there must be an awareness of perceiving in the very first step, at the very first step, either, depending on your reading, in the very act itself, it must be aware of itself,
right?
Or that somehow there's a capacity which is aware of it. And that's the same argument that Franz Brentano uses as sort of the beginning of modern contemporary philosophy of mind, in his Psychology from an Empirical Standpoint, is just a commentary on Aristotle there.
Right.
And of course, the assumptions are different. I mean, Aristotle thinks that every mental state is aware, reflexively aware in this way. Whereas I think that most of us are inclined to think, no, you might have some mental states of which you're not aware.
Right.
And so, I mean, you know, that's another good example of something where you don't find it until later, but it is present in antiquity, that namely unconscious mental states, contentful, having intentionality of their own, maybe involved in behavior in various ways, but of which the personal agent is not aware.
So you say you do find that in antiquity?
You absolutely do. I mean, you certainly find it in, say, someone like Plotinus. So there are mental states of which the individual is not aware. But you find questions about it, or worries about it, from earlier on. I mean, so I think that indirectly, somebody like Aristotle is concerned with that. Even if he rejects it, it's on the horizon. It's in the horizon of possibilities.
Interesting. Yeah, because I was thinking that the sort of distinctively modern question might be, or contemporary question anyway, might be, what distinguishes the unconscious mental states from the conscious ones? And higher order theories are typically aimed at trying to answer that question. Right. And it didn't seem to me like Aristotle really had that. I mean, as you say in your paper on this, he kind of just takes it as a basic datum about consciousness, that we always are aware of our perceptions or perceive our own perceptions. He doesn't really argue for that, right? That's a kind of a bedrock foundational thing.
That's right. He doesn't argue for it, although he does he does argue against the opposing view. So, I mean, he
Right.
does say, right, you can't be unaware. That's an incoherent kind of thought. I mean, they're not extensive arguments, but it comes up a number of times that he thinks you have to be aware of it.
Yeah. What is the argument against against having a perception that we're unaware
of? So he doesn't argue. He doesn't argue. He doesn't offer an argument directly against that, but it comes up a couple of times in his treatise on. Comes up twice in his treatise on perceiving, the De Sensu, and he rejects it as, I mean, he focuses on it explicitly as a position to be rejected. It's not that he offers reasons against it. I mean, I think there is that kind of gap, is he just doesn't take seriously or doesn't worry about this as a possibility.
I see. Okay.
And I think I think I mean, we can only speculate, I think, at that point. But I think that one thing is that he must take it to be a necessary and indeed essential feature of what he calls perceiving, aisthanesthai, that one has awareness.
Uh-huh.
And his way of explaining it is in terms of this higher order a directedness. And what's interesting about his position is he doesn't take there to be due to other mental states focused on it, the way you might if you were introspecting or reflecting, but that he takes there to be a kind of reflexive self-directedness of each mental act. And he's not troubled by that. And Brentano was the same way. He thought that, that every mental act was directed at itself, not primarily, but secondarily on the side was the expression.
Right. So I am curious about that, because I mean, there are some people who still try to take this kind of line, like there's Uriah Kriegel, and maybe to a lesser extent, but yeah, in the same camp, I say Rocco Gennaro. But I don't think either of those guys are really trying to say what Aristotle's trying to say, because so for Rocco especially, it's like the higher order content is aimed at the lower order content.
Right.
So you still have this distinction there, but I don't think that's what Aristotle's saying, basically. So how does he imbue this self-representation?
Yeah, not as I've interpreted it. I mean, my memory of Rocco's work is that he says, look, we still have to draw a distinction. I'm good with that. There has to be a distinction between the lower order content and the higher order content, and these are two distinct types of mental state.
Right.
But I argue that Aristotle's argument commits him to the view that it must be the same token event that instantiates both types. And so that it really is self-directed. And from what I remember, Rocco is more inclined to say, look, there must be two distinct parts.
Right.
And one part instantiates one type and the other part instantiates the other type. And the higher order type is directed at the lower order type. Uriah, who I taught actually years and years ago, definitely goes off in other directions. I haven't kept up with the most recent stuff, so I can't comment on that. But yeah, I don't think he's inclined to take it that way. I should say that that my reading of De Anima 3.2 is something of an outlier. I think that I went back and said, look, this is how Franz Brentano read it. And I mean, he just took it for granted. And he just said, this is obviously what Aristotle's thinking. And I thought, actually, this is a completely defensible reading. And so I developed an argument to show this is actually the best way of understanding how the arguments work. But many people read it instead in a fairly different way, where it's really not about mental acts or mental events, but it's about mental capacities. And they think that it gives a reason for committing Aristotle to a kind of internal monitoring theory, so like some kind of inner sense which is directed at it. And I think it's a very different reading of Aristotle. But
is that what you call the strong capacities reading?
Well, I think nobody holds the strong capacity.
Okay, so the moderate one.
So I think that, I mean, just to give the in skeletal form, the structure of the argument is this passage at the beginning of chapter 2 of book 3 depends heavily on the word aesthesis, and then instances of it like opsis, which is for vision. And in Aristotle, these are flagged as systematically ambiguous between a capacity for perception or for sight or for vision and the activity that capacity exercises. So perceiving, seeing. And most everyone reads it in terms of the capacity view. And so translations that you'll find of this, the common translations you'll find, revert to capacity readings throughout. And if you were really strict about it, and that would give you the strong capacity reading, it would give you a position that nobody's actually defended, and I think is not really at all attractive. I mean, it may occupy a position in logical space, but it's not, it's not a serious live option.
I see, okay.
And I said, that's kind of an interesting problem, because if you look at it in terms of activities and you translate the passage quite differently, and that's how Brentano understood it, you get a very coherent reading, you get a very powerful argument, and one which has this immediate implication about the consciousness of individual acts of perceiving, that they involve an awareness of themselves. And because it's both higher order, so it can be explained in terms of intentionality, and because it's reflexive, that is in the sense that it's self-directed, it captures both the intuitions of kind of intrinsic theories of consciousness, which see consciousness as kind of luminous, feature of each individual act, and higher order theories, which say this intrinsic theory is mysterious. Higher order theory gives you intentionality, content, structure. We can analyze it, we know how to approach it. And so this view says you get both of those because the higher order state is directed at itself. You can't get that on a capacity reading. Most people who read this, the large majority of people who read this passage, try a hybrid reading without really paying attention to what they're doing. And so they read it as being about capacities in many of the occurrences of these words, and then they understand it in terms of activities.
Right.
So they say, well, there must be a regress of capacities that has to be stopped. There has to be some capacity which is aware of the initial capacity, say, of vision or of hearing. But what it's aware of are the acts of that initial capacity. And so that's what I call the moderate capacity reading. Right, and it's an old view. So if you go back to, I think one of the greatest Aristotelian commentators, Alexander of Aphrodisias, he's 2nd to 3rd century before the Common Era. And he's right up there alongside Averroes and Thomas Aquinas. And he's in many ways much closer to contemporary Aristotelian readings than anybody else. He has a moderate capacity reading too. He just mixes the two ideas together in this way. Another person who does this recently, who's very critical of my work, is Thomas Johansson, who has a defense of inner sense reading of Aristotle.
So part of your argument against the moderate capacity reading then is it doesn't make sense of the context and some of the other discussions that Aristotle is having that you can find. And I guess also a part of it is that there's this background of something to do that was talked about in Plato, that it wouldn't read well against the kind of Platonic background or thing he's reacting to.
Yeah, I think that the issue here is that it doesn't actually fit the language in the text. And so if the more closely you scrutinize the text, the harder it is to maintain this view. So, I mean, it's kind of like soft, worn flannel. It feels very comfortable. It seems very intuitive, right? And so people think, oh, well, that must be what he's talking about. And it's just kind of hand wavy when you get to the text, because if you say, well, but look at this sentence and look at this phrase, and the whole passage ends where it says, and it is aware of itself in the Greek. And the only way to construe that construction is aware of itself is reflexively. Whereas on this kind of common reading, what you get is a capacity is aware of its activities. And so it just doesn't make sense of the Greek. And that's the same is true about Plato and the Charmides. So Plato and the Charmides he's interested there in a kind of knowledge that would be directed at itself. And he's worried about all sorts of puzzles that arise. And in one of these passages, he just goes through a string of different cases: belief of beliefs, fear of fears, love of loves, so on like this. And once again, I think that if you look closely at the text, grammatically, the most coherent way of construing the phrasing, the way he's formulated it, is in terms of these acts rather than capacities. If you just spelled out what the alternative reading would be, it's not a live option. And so it's funny for me to be saying this, because I think a complaint that people might raise is, how is he finding all these contemporary issues in these ancient texts? That sounds really anachronistic. It's projection. It's not rooted in the text. And my point is, if you actually look at the wording in the text, right, it fits with certain views and not with others, and that's the basis for it.
Yeah, I mean, I thought that I found your reading to be pretty natural, actually, that it's a self-reflective awareness. One thing that I was wondering about was what the content of the self-reflexive part was, especially from, like, if you factor in that it's a perception and that you have a particular reading of Aristotle's theory of perception. Mm-hmm. So I wonder, like, what can we say about the actual content? Is it like, I am seeing the azure sky, or is it something is it non-conceptual, obviously? Like, what's going on at that part?
Right. So that's a very interesting question. I think that at this point, there's only so much that the texts are explicit about, and it's really much more a question of tracing out the implications and seeing which ones are consistent and which ones make the most coherent sense of what we've got there in the broader context of his views. I think it is a really interesting question, because depending on how you specify the higher order content of those states, he might be vulnerable to various regress arguments that he doesn't consider, but that he easily could. And so a good example of this, a good discussion of this is at the very end. It's a long paper, but there's an appendix. It's not in the appendix. It's in one of the final sections has objections and replies.
Yeah, the regressive content.
Yeah, and I think that it's easy to raise this sort of worry about if every type of perceptual content, if there had to be awareness of every type of perceptual content, then you would get a regress that he couldn't solve in this way. And this is not an original sort of view. I suggest there that there's, you see Gilbert Ryle talk about this in terms of self-intimation, where he has in mind something very specific that relates to the content of these higher order states. And I also found it, I ran across it just by sort of reading widely in the history of philosophy. There's a very interesting philosopher. I think he's in Australia, Udo Thiel, Thiel, who's written extensively about consciousness in the early modern period. And it was through reading his research that I came across this criticism of John Locke, contemporary criticism of John Locke, which raises precisely this sort of worry. There's no trace of it in Aristotle. So what I did was I just said, does he have the resources to answer this? Could he stop this regress? And one way to think of it is that he thinks that every act of perception must be an object of awareness, but not every type that it instantiates. And that would stop the regress from getting out of the starting blocks.
So the basic idea is that because the act is self-reflexive, you're aware of it, but you're not aware of the self-reflexive type, the higher order content.
Not
type.
Every type it instantiates, and that would be. I mean, there would be good reason for thinking that he might have the motivation. We don't have any extensive discussion in him, but he seems to have this intuition that every token act must be an object of awareness. We must be conscious in that sense. But there's no reason to think that he would believe that every type, even every mental type, even every content type, was itself conscious in that way, an object of awareness. And that would hold generally, I think, for his views about perception of external objects. So, so I have, this is a paper which I have a draft version up on my academia.edu site on perceptual content in Aristotle. But it's under review. I haven't revised it yet and sent it back. And I argue there that for a fairly rich notion of perceptual content, but one which in which the subject will not be aware of every perceptible feature that an external object instantiates. So the way I put it is that perception is selective. It's not just that certain capacities, like say vision, are responsive to certain ranges of properties, but even with an individual object of that type, you might not be perceiving all the relevant aspects.
Right.
And so this would just be parallel to that. You might not be aware of all the features of your mental acts. And that would be a good thing, right? Because there would be so many different features that it would instantiate, right. And it would be implausible to think that you were aware of all those things. So the view is, right, he's got this pervasive notion of consciousness. All of these acts are conscious in the sense that they're objects of awareness, but not in every regard.
Right. So then what do you think the content, the exact, like, how could we specify the content of the higher order part of the awareness? Is it, which form is it receiving, I guess, or something like that?
So, I mean, that's an interesting question, right? So just as a side note, you're referring to his account of first order perception, which involves receiving the form of the object, the form of the perceptible object without the matter.
Right.
And I think many people take that to be a definition. And so they say, well, if higher order awareness is a kind of perception, then it must involve receiving the form. I actually just read something the other day by Sophie Chappelle that made just this move just a week ago. And I think there's no reason to infer that. In fact, I think it's unlikely that he has that view. Okay. Just for the following reason, this is incidental to your question, but just for the following reason, that's a cause. He analyzes first order acts of perception causally, and so there's a causal transaction between an external object which stimulates the organ and the capacity and brings it into activity, and that activation is to be understood in terms of receiving the form, the perceptible form of the object. So it's a causal analysis of first order perception. What I argued for in the consciousness paper is that Aristotle can't view the self-reflexive nature of awareness causally, because he thinks that this is actually, it's immediate, it's necessary, it's infallible, at least with regard to the existence of the object. I mean, there are a number of features about it that make it very different. He doesn't give an account of it, but I'm just sort of pursuing the implications of this reading. So your question is, okay, well, fine, let's grant all that, right? What is how are we supposed to understand this higher order content? And I think I'm inclined to resist the idea that it would be expressed as a propositional attitude, in the sense that there's a, a report of it would involve a dependent that clause, right? So I perceive that I am perceiving, or that I'm seeing a lavender bush, right? Something like that. It doesn't preclude that, but I don't think it requires that.
Okay.
And for a simple reason, I think that while some perceptual content can be articulated in that way for Aristotle, and is conceptual, does have conceptual elements to it, where there's both a subject, which is the subject of the dependent clause is conceived of in a certain way, and the predicate also in a certain way. I think that Aristotle's basic model of perceiving, and I would extend it to higher order perceiving, is a kind of de re attitude. So the way I would formulate it is, instead of S perceives that P, and we could analyze P however you want. It's more that S perceives X as F.
Right.
Okay. Now, for some people, that's just a wash. There's no difference between propositional content with a that clause and perceiving an object as having a certain property, because you would still be thinking of that object as instantiating that property or exemplifying that property. And therefore, we're looking at something which is more like a state of affairs, right? The difference, I take it, is this, that if you understand perceiving as a de re attitude in this way, and I take it this is the basic notion that Dretske has in Knowledge and the Flow of Information, okay, is that there's some sort of engagement with an object, however it's described, okay? We can give true perceptual reports of the engagement with that object, however it's described, but our perception of it is regarding it as having a certain characteristic, a certain feature or property. And that would belong typically within the range of properties that sensory organ is sensitive to, right? And my suggestion in this paper, this unpublished paper, is that that's an essential feature of all perceiving for Aristotle, including the perception of what he calls, these special perceptibles like red, flavors like sweet, and colors like red, and temperatures like warm, and so forth. Right. You're still perceiving this particular object as warm. And that's true even for young children who don't have a conceptual repertoire yet, haven't developed conceptual capacities fully, and also for non-human animals who don't have, according to Aristotle, don't have conceptual capacities. It's that they have sensory receptors that are responsive to features, to types of things. At the most basic level, it will be built in, it will be wired in, that they're just responsive to certain ranges of qualities. And it doesn't require, in Phrygian language, right? It doesn't require subsumption under a concept. So I think that what I argue in that paper is that people move too quickly from perceiving X as F to saying that means subsuming it under a concept. That means having conceptual capacities. And if Aristotle thinks that non-human animals don't have conceptual capacities and very young children don't have conceptual capacities, then they can't perceive things as anything, and therefore are not responsive to it. And that's clearly not Aristotle's view. Aristotle thinks that our conceptual capacities, the possession of particular concepts of, say, F or G or H, whatever, warm or sweet, derives from perceptions of those very qualities. And so he's got to have some sort of empiricist story about how conceptual content and concept possession evolves from perceivings, which have that very same content. That's in a simple case, not logically complex concepts, negative concepts, things like that. And so those basic perceptions have to have as features of their content general qualities or features,
Yeah.
even though you don't have a concept of them. They have to be responsive to them. And so, and I think that there's textual evidence for that. I think that Aristotle talks in at least two places in his Posterior Analytics about how perception is that we always perceive particulars, but perception is of the universal or general feature of them. And I think the best way of understanding those two aspects of perception is with the de re attitude. Perception is always this direct relation to an actual particular object. However you describe it, there's a direct relationship there. But it's being sensitive to some feature, some general feature of that object. And so S perceives X as F, for me, is kind of the canonical formulation of a perceptual report. Well, that's a long way around to your question, right? So the higher I would tend to, that's how I would approach the higher, or the content of the higher order perceiving, right?
So that it would be a kind of non-conceptual representation of the universal aspect of the first order perception?
It doesn't require the possession of concepts.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to exclude that you can have a conceptualized, right, perception. I think that Aristotle, he doesn't talk about it much, but he does mention it at various points about the ways that different mental faculties cooperate in the exercise of a single act. And he doesn't have any problem with perceptions involving conceptual ability. So I don't want to exclude a more sophisticated perception. His whole ethics relies on those sorts of sophisticated perceivings, right?
Yeah, because he says you just see the correct action in the right circumstance.
You do, or even if you want to be more conscious about it, cautious about it, excuse me, he wants the individual ethical agent to be sensitive to features of the situation, often subtle features of the particular situation, and has to have the kind of, we would call it judgment, but I don't mean that propositionally, who has the sense, right, about which features are relevant in the circumstances ethically.
Right.
That's highly sophisticated, right, and has to involve all sorts of cognitive abilities, right, memory, experience, thought, and so forth. But that can operate at in a fairly immediate, spontaneous sort of way as part of our everyday interactions without necessarily involving lots of reflection and introspection and things like that.
Right.
So I think that you can have this more sophisticated content,
but it's not required.
I don't think it's required, and he can't, right? Because if he really holds to this commitment he has about how pervasive perceptual consciousness is. This is in the Nicomachean Ethics in Book 9, Chapter 9. He just makes these incredible claims, right? That any activity that an animate being that has perception, they're aware of it.
Right.
Well, if that's true of all animals who have perception, he thinks that perception is what defines animals. It distinguishes animals from, say, plants. And if he thinks that goes all the way down to sea anemones, right, who retract when they're touched, right? And it's not clear what he thinks about sponges, okay? But I mean, if you have it going all the way down to very rudimentary animal life, where it seems reasonable to ascribe perceptual capacities to them. And he says, oh, no, if it's perceiving, they're aware that they're perceiving. It sure better not be conceptual.
Right. Yeah. It's or they better have concepts, which he explicitly denies.
Right. Well, he doesn't think that dogs or horses have concepts, right? And he's very clear about the kinds of sophisticated activities that animals are capable of, right? I think there are all these stories in the history of animals. I mean, there are various examples, right? But there's stories in the history of animals of a horse that has sex with another horse that's cloaked, and it turns out to be its mother, and then it goes off and kills itself. because it realizes that it's its mother. So
Is that true? Wow.
how much he believes all this is another question. I mean, he recounts lots of stories in the history of animals, but he's willing to ascribe to them a kind of, he calls it intelligence.
Right.
They're obviously capable of very sophisticated kinds of activities.
I mean, one wonders if maybe this isn't partially.
If I could just interject there. I mean,
oh yeah, sorry.
That's one of the great things in Richard Sorabji's book, Animal Minds and Morals, that really looks at these richer perceptual activities and capabilities that animals have. And he's absolutely right. It's just scattered throughout the corpus, this recognition that animals can do quite a lot. It's us who say, well, but they don't have concepts according to Aristotle. So how can they do all these things without possessing concepts?
Right.
And Richard is exactly right to say, because Aristotle thinks that you could do it with other capacities, that other capacities are richer than we had previously thought.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. But what I was just about to ask, and what makes me wonder is, well, I guess I have a couple of things. One is I wonder if partially this is a terminological dispute about what counts as a concept, because you might say that Aristotle's notion of a concept is pretty heavy duty, kind of thing that figures in, universal statements and A and O statements or whatever.
Right.
And we might have a lower bar for what counts as a concept, same with recognizing the same thing or something like that, sorting. And so animals clearly can do that. So we might say that whether they have concepts could ultimately become this kind of, it's not if you mean concept A, and it is if you mean concept B. So do you think something like that could be going on with Aristotle's notion of concept? And if so, why should we adopt his way of using?
So I think that, this is something that I do address in this unpublished paper.
Right, exactly.
That's on the website. I think that, I don't think it's just terminological. But I think it does require us to be careful about how we're using these terms. So I think that very often philosophers, not all, not the ones who work on concepts in particular, but many philosophers in reasoning about this slide very easily between universals and concepts. Even the one's out there in the world that is exemplified in objects in the world, and the other is something that individual subjects can be said to possess. There's a kind of equivalence, so that if you have one, you have the other. So if we're talking about universals as featuring in the content of mental states, there must be concepts that are possessed in some way or other. And I think that for dealing with somebody like Aristotle, it's absolutely right to focus on how universals feature in the content of various kinds of states. And so at that level, I would agree with you, right? He's going to say, look, on the view I'm putting forward, the reading I'm putting forward, perception is going to be of universals in a certain regard, and thinking is going to be, so why not just call them concepts? Right. And I want to say, yes, to the first part, that it's about universals, that both of these different kinds of states, perceptual states and various kinds of higher cognitive states, are about universals. But the ways in which they grasp universals and the ways in which universals figure in the content of those states is different, and we can specify the differences, right? So the sorts of tasks that one has to be capable of in perception with regard to universals, like sorting, recognition, right? That sort of thing, is one kind of grasp, as it were, and what we can do with concepts that we possess is another thing. So the ability to articulate in language, the ability to generalize and infer. There are certain kinds of abstract functions that we're capable of in virtue of possessing a concept. Both of these involve universals, I'll grant you that, but the kinds of activities that are involved and the capacities for them are different. And I think that it's useful to say that concept possession is about this abstract rational ability, and things like recognition, while they're connected and we can draw connections between them, Aristotle thinks one evolves out of the other,
right?
That they're fundamentally different functions, and at bottom different functions.
So, and what, so if, even if you accepted that, like, that they're
Yeah.
different, and I agree with you, they are different. And one thing you might add to that is kind of the thing that Jerry Fodor talked about just like being able to think about F as F, right? Being able to
Right.
think about it as that sort of thing. So I guess Aristotle would deny that animals could do that as well, although they could perceive it as that sort of thing, but they couldn't think about it, I guess. But okay. But so even if you granted all that, I wonder why you wouldn't want to call that sort of thing a concept. Um, so granted, you can't do these other things with it, but if it's, yeah, I guess I don't really see why you would want to reserve concept for the more heavy duty thing.
Well, at a certain level, you might not worry. I just think that that these different kinds of activities are sufficiently different that it's useful to speak about them differently. So, for example, I think that what's really crucial about the capacity for inference, say, has to do with the generality of these terms and our ability to combine them and recombine them in different sorts of ways, right? So the kind of thing Evans has in mind when he talks about, right, the generality constraint and so forth. And those sorts of moves are not, it's not necessary that you have those abilities in order to sort things, to recognize something as being of a particular type, to respond to it in certain ways if it's of a certain type. Not having linguistic abilities, not having inferential abilities, and so forth. And so it seems to me that there's something quite distinctive that one acquires when one acquires a concept in this more general and rational sense. Right. And it's useful to distinguish those two. If you want to use the familiar word concept for all of them, okay. But when we talk about concept possession, we often have in mind linguistic dispositions and various kinds of rational dispositions in terms of inference and so forth. And that's not required.
Yeah, that's not required. I agree with that. So would Aristotle deny that they can think about, like, can a raven think about, can it have thoughts at all, or they that's just something they can't do, right? Don't they only perceive? So I know there are passages where he says, like, the lion just perceives that this is its food. Yeah. It sort of sees directly, or in some sense, it is food, but it doesn't ever have thoughts about that. Is that on his view, right?
He doesn't think that their thoughts. He's very clear, right, that they don't have intellect or understanding. In Greek, it's nous. Right. And as a result of that, they don't have noemata. They don't have what I think we would translate as concepts. They do lots of things that you and I might describe as thinking, or casually, or as the lion smells, or the lion hears the lowing of the cattle, right? And he thinks to himself, there's dinner, right? Right. So Aristotle describes exactly this feature, this scenario in the Nicomachean Ethics in Book 3, Chapter 10. And it's a very interesting passage where he's ascribing pretty complex reactions to a lion. But he's not explaining it in terms of thinking. So this lion has some experience. It has memories, which have collated in certain ways. So he can recognize that it's cattle. And he has some memory of cattle being delicious, right? So he hears the lowing and he starts to salivate, right? So what is that? Well, you might be inclined to say he thinks, oh, there are cattle over the hill, and he thinks that could be my next meal, and he infers from that, right? That would be delicious, and I'm hungry, and then starts to salivate. But that whole story that we've just projected onto this cattle is one theory, but it's not by any means an inevitable kind of account to give. And I think that what Aristotle seems to want to do is to say, no, it's all done through perceptual abilities, memory, experience, perceiving, and these can be combined in certain ways that are sufficient to adequately explain the lion's behavior. It's salivating, it's getting poised to chase, and so forth. And it's all goal directed and all that stuff. But that's going to be understood in terms of these different capacities and their responsiveness to certain perceptual features of the environment.
Yeah. And so one question I have about this is sort of a side question, but since we're talking about this, I wonder if I could ask you. One question that I'm thinking about is with respect to the practical syllogism.
Yeah.
So when in human actions, the major premise of the practical syllogism is a conceptual thing. It's like, all of these things are sweet or something. Then the second one is the perceptual bit. This thing is sweet or something. And then so the conclusion is like, eat it or something. But that's not the way we explain the lion's behavior. So I'm wondering why couldn't we give the same explanation of human behavior without all this extra cognitive stuff? Not to say it's not there, but why does it feature an explanation of behavior?
So on my view, just before we get to the practical syllogism, on my view, this more rudimentary explanation will work for human beings in certain circumstances.
Oh, okay.
It's just that human beings are also capable of much more highly cognitive versions of this as well. The same kinds of explanations will apply to us, but then we can add to that because we've got these additional capacities which are integrated together with perception. But the point you raised about the practical syllogism is really right on target, because that's an inference, right? And if you take the practical syllogism here, so we're thinking of Nicomachean Ethics, Book 7, Chapter 3 in particular, but also in his essay on the motion of animals, in Chapter 7 at much greater length. It looks like he's explaining action as resulting from reasoning through, deliberating through various premises, even if it's a short sequence. On the motion of animals, it's a longer sequence, or allows for that. And then acting on that basis, it looks highly rational.
Right.
And he clearly doesn't intend that to only apply to cases where you are consciously reflecting on what should I do, and if I do this, and this is the occasion, and now I better act. He has in mind things that are much more spontaneous.
Right.
And on the motion of animals, it's explicit that it's to apply to animals too.
Huh.
Right. So if you think that it involves inference, and if you think that inference necessarily involves concepts, then suddenly he would be ascribing rational abilities and concept possession quite widely. I myself am inclined to think that even though there are elements of these passages, especially on the motion of animals, that look like they're talking about psychologically real processes, that a more charitable way of understanding both of these passages is that they're explanatory reconstructions that make sense, make intelligible why animals, including human animals, respond in the ways that they do, because they've got certain commitments, certain general commitments, like cattle, beef is tasty, right? And there's some beef, right?
Yeah.
And the lion moves on it. They involve certain general commitments about what is attractive or repellent, of what is good, beneficial, or harmful, and then certain immediate perceptions about the immediate environment one finds oneself in. And if you view it in that sort of context, then our explanation of behavior will go through an inference, but it needn't be a psychologically real process that the subject is going through. In particular, the lion is not going through inferences, and most of us don't either most of the time. But our action is intelligible because it exhibits that structure. It manifests that structure.
Uh-huh. So it's an artifact of explanation of the behavior, but not a causal explanation of it, but more like a rational interpretation of it.
It's a rational interpretation of it, but it's not unconnected with the causal processes. So to give you the rational explanation, I've got to use inferences. I'm going to use concepts, often quite sophisticated concepts, like say prey or predator, right? Something like that, that we wouldn't ascribe a concept of predator, right, to the sheep that's trembling, right? But at the same time, it's not projected onto the sheep without any kind of a ground or basis, right? So the thought would be sheep are responsive to seeing wolves. They're appropriately afraid because they recognize, right, that's in some sense we would say that's dangerous. But how are they going to do that without having a concept? Well, they're sensitive to certain perceptual types or certain kind of perceptual universals that we would articulate using vocabulary like predator and so forth. And so the rational explanation will be a lot beefier, right, than the causal explanation, but it's not that the causal explanation is non-cognitive, right, or unrelated to the general features which are cited in the rational explanation. That's what I think.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, going back to the stuff about perception really fast, I really found this paper really interesting. I'll put links to all this, by the way, afterwards so that people can find this stuff on your page. But because, I was taught the basic, I think, kind of canonical line, which is that Aristotle says you perceive particular things and you think about universal things. And what you try to do is split the difference, basically. So you always perceive a particular thing, but as having a universal attribute or something like that.
That's right. That's right.
And I think that's a really interesting reading. Although I was trying to make sense of like what the actual mental state that you would be in, what the content that it would have is. So on your view, is it that there's like in our modern language, we would say like a qualitative aspect to it that represents the universal type, but isn't conceptual, or like what exactly? So I know you put it in terms of like it's state non-conceptual, not, so we have these distinctions we make, but I still wasn't sure exactly what you thought the content of it was or how it connected to the universal.
Right. So I want to avoid I want to avoid framing it in terms of qualia or things like that, because I don't think that Aristotle has a kind of indirect realism. So, I mean, some people do think that he's committed to this, where you're aware of something which is somehow internal to the system, whether it's sense data and qualia, or whether it's the representations, that one is aware of them and thereby aware of something in the world. I think that Aristotle thinks we're aware and animals are aware of features of the world. But the idea is roughly this, that it's not the case, as some people often phrase it, that our senses just register. That's the word that people often use. They just register qualities like red, yellow, right? I think it's much more like what Richard Sorabji said, which is, the horse can detect an odor in a certain direction. So it's, pungent here, or, acrid there.
Right.
So there's going to be, it's going to be, we might say it's predicative in some basic sense. It's combining things in a certain way. It's seeing this as that, right? But it's not going to involve concepts. It's not going to involve propositional attitudes. It's going to be what I was describing before as a de re attitude, where you have a relationship to a particular object as exemplifying a certain type or kind or feature.
Yeah, but how does it do it, I guess, is what I'm asking. How does the as bit get in there?
I don't think we get more than this. I
Okay.
Kind of the end of the line is something like this. Perception is brought about by perceptible objects acting on us. And so we perceive that very thing which is acting on us as F, where F is within the range of sensitivities that organ has, right? So I've got color detectors and to an extent shape detectors, right? And so, my eyes are responding to this as square or as blue, something like that. And if you say, well, how does it get blue in there? It's going to be, well, when a blue thing acts on my eye, its blueness, it's being blue, acts upon the eyeball in a particular way so that I'm aware of it as blue. How is that? Well, Aristotle says in On the Soul, Book 2, Chapter 12, right, that it receives the form of that object. And then he says in this troubling, mysterious phrase, without the matter, that everybody's fought about for over 2,000 years. And my account of that is that talk about reception for Aristotle just means taking on a quality. Mm-hmm. And the simplest reading is the kind that Richard Sorabji, Steve Neverson, others mentioned, which is, well, it's just exemplifying the very quality that the object has, right? So just the same way you heat the water in a tea kettle, right? The heat from the heating element, the flame or the electrical element is warm, and it makes the water warm. The water receives warmth from the heating element, okay? Right. So too, in perception, blue objects make my eye go blue, something like that. Now, I think that that's wrong for various reasons. I mean, there's an extensive discussion of all the different interpretations in a paper of mine called The Spirit and the Letter, because there are these two positions on this about, one is called literalism, the one I just described, right, and another one called spiritualism because of something Thomas Aquinas said. And it doesn't matter. So that
and Aristotle does say that the eye or it becomes colored, but not like in the same way as the object is colored, which is against literalism, I guess. I would say.
Right. So that's a later passage in Dionymous On the Soul, Book 3, Chapter 2. But also controversial. It's all controversial. But what I've argued, and I think I put this paper, a recent paper, up on academia.edu as well, on Aristotle on the transmission of information, how to receive form without the matter, or receiving form without the matter. And that's an expansion of the last part of my paper on the Spirit and the Letter, where I say, here's an alternative view. It's a physical interaction. This is brought about by ordinary physical objects with their physical properties, like color. He thinks that's a real property of external objects, colors, odors, and so forth. And those properties stimulate our organs in a particular way, but not in a way where the quality is replicated or duplicated. So when you warm the water in your kettle, you do replicate the warmth. You cause there to be the very same kind of quality in the object that's acted on.
Right.
In this case, it is like that in a way, but not exactly like that. And that's what without the matter means, is that you don't, the subject, the sense organs of the subject don't embody that very quality. So that's how I'm understanding without the matter, is they don't embody that very quality by replicating it. They only take on a certain abstract feature of that quality. Aristotle thinks it's a proportion, that all perceptible qualities can be understood as ratios of particular qualities. So every color is a ratio of black to white. And so the idea is that that's actually a defining feature of each of the colors. So it's not just any abstract feature, it's a defining feature, something that's essential to each of those specific perceptible qualities. That abstract feature is instantiated in the organ. So when the blue thing acts on my eye, it doesn't make it blue, but it does make it take on a certain ratio of qualities that make it blue when it's instantiated in that material. The difference is that my eye jelly is transparent, and that ratio is not instantiated in colors in the eyeball. That's why it doesn't go blue, but it's instantiated in two other to other qualities. If it does that, and that's speculative on my part, but if it does that, then it's something like what we call transduction, right? So there's a certain pattern of energy or change in an object, right? That is preserved, right? That signal is preserved in a different medium, right? Through causal means, right? If you think about sound recording and the way in which we play back sound recording through speakers and so forth, right? There's the idea is that a certain, say, melody is preserved as a signal throughout all of those different changes. And it's embodied at each stage in different material forms, right? That are causally related and causally related to the playback at the end, at the final stage when we replay it through our speakers so that we can hear it. But the idea is that it's that abstract feature which is transmitted. And it's not, as I said, any abstract feature. It's not accidental to the melody or the color or things like that, but it's what is essential to its being that color or that melody. If that's what receiving form without the matter is, then there's an explanation, right, for why I am perceiving this object, which is currently acting on me as blue, is it's made me take on a certain ratio that's essential to its being blue. And I see it as blue because I've received from it that very same ratio.
Yeah, I mean, when you put it that way, it is kind of almost, I mean, I don't know. Yeah, it almost beggars belief that Aristotle didn't come on something like the hard problem, because here we have an abstract thing, a ratio being instantiated in me. We also have an awareness in me of that perceptual state. And yet I perceive it as blue out there. But my eye doesn't turn blue in any way, even though I have an essential feature of that thing. So it just seems like, it's kind of interesting that he doesn't come up with the idea or wrestle with the idea of how something that's a physical, because I assume he thinks it's a physical state. I mean, Aristotle is not a dualist in any way that
I think that's right.
I read him. So there's a physical state of the eye, which is instantiating this, but yet representing the blue out there, and I don't experience it as a property of myself. I mean, I think that's the central point of your Cartesian theater paper, is that it's wrong to interpret them that way.
That's right.
So yeah, I don't know.
So I think,
why does he think this is unproblematic, I guess is what I would say.
Well, so I think that I mean, for me, the kind of the pivotal point is that all of this machinery, this internal machinery, whether it's physical, so he thinks it's taking place in the heart and the bloodstream, which he thinks is coming, through the various sensory channels from the peripheral sense organs. He doesn't think that, I don't think, he thinks that we're aware of those bodies as such, or their states as such. And I also don't think that he thinks that we're aware of mental entities like images or sense data or things like that. As you said, right, in his view, we're aware of objects in the world that are acting on us and their perceptible properties out there. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means he's thinking of all of what's going on inside of us, which does have a physical basis, as under the hood. It's by undergoing those changes in that way that we're aware of objects in the world. It's not by being aware of those changes, it's just by having them. So there's a very good example. This was something I hit on early in my career. It was while I was doing my dissertation. There's this funny little digression in the second chapter of On Memory and Recollection, short essay on memory and recollection. It's in chapter 2. And what he's interested in, the context in, is how do we order our memories chronologically? How do we know that something is earlier rather than later, and so forth? And there's this complex discussion about timestamps, how we date stamp these different things, and how we can judge that something is further away or closer temporally. And in the middle of this, there's this funny little digression where he says it's got to be the same way that we think about objects that are large and far away.
Hmm.
And he says, it's not, he says, by thoughts stretching out to those objects, the way that there are these extramission theories of vision, right? Which have some ocular ray leaving the eye and going out there in the world. He says, it's not like that because you can think of things, you think in the same way, he says, even when they don't exist. And if they don't exist, then it can't go, there's nowhere to go to, right? So he says, and this is for me was the really kind of pivotal point. He says, it's by the proportionate change. It's by undergoing a change, not by being aware of a change that models the objects thought about, but by having a change, by undergoing a change. And then there's a series of like 4 to 6 lines where he describes quite complex 4-dimensional analog representations of objects interacting in the world. He says you've got the same, he says you've got, and that preserve the proportions, right? The relation structure and the proportions of the objects in the world. So he says they have proportional magnitudes, they have proportional shapes, they have proportional distances, they have proportional changes, right? So it's kind of like there's this old book, I think it's from the 40s, by a man named Craik, C-R-A-I-K. It's called The Nature of Explanation. But the middle chapter about this is about theory of representation, except that you could think it was just like Fodor, right? Or Polition, somebody like that, except that he was talking about analog representations. He was talking about the Kelvin tide predictor and stuff like that.
Right.
And the way in which, right, certain stimuli are translated into a model, transformations are performed on the model, and you get certain output, which then can apply to things in the world. And it just seems to me this is exactly like that. There's nothing here that's said about watching or observing or imagining. It's just by undergoing these changes. And so I guess in a way, a lot of this stuff for me comes back to an old scholastic distinction that I think is really useful. It's the difference between, when thinking about representations, it's the difference between that towards which a representation is directed. So in Latin, ad quem, the id ad quem, that towards which it's directed or focused on, and the id a quo, that by which it's focused on something.
We would say the vehicle.
Right. Or the features of that vehicle, right? In virtue of which it has that kind of content. Right, exactly. And I think that, you see in like early modern theories, the idea is that these two go together. And so it's by being aware of a representation which is directed at this object that we're aware of the object. And I think that the great move that was made in the 20th century is to just leave behind this question of the ad quem, that towards which it's directed, and say, no, it's just that by which, representations are that by which we're aware of other things, and we separate them in that way. And I think that the very same distinction, fairly simple distinction, but basic distinction, is true when we look at ancient representationalists like Aristotle and the Stoics.
So then the basic idea then is that for Aristotle, you're aware of the representation, but what you're aware of the content of the representation as opposed to its vehicle?
I think that although there might be exceptional circumstances where you are aware of a representation, I think in general, he doesn't think you're aware of the representation.
He doesn't.
He doesn't. It's that by having the representation, one either is aware of some object in the world, or in a case like dreaming, it seems that one is aware of objects in the world. But one's not aware of the representation itself. That's merely the means by which we're aware of these things.
I guess the only reason why I'm puzzled is because that sounds like very much like a modern first order representationalism, like Dretske. But how do you factor in the awareness of the perception of the perception into this feature? Because there it seems like you get into a little bit of trouble.
Yeah, that's not going to be accounted for in the same way. I think that's a very perceptive point. In the consciousness paper, I point out that this can't this aspect of his theory can't be handled in just the same way. He doesn't have an account of that. I think that it's not because of the way he characterizes it, or the way anyway he's committed to thinking about it. It can't be a causal effect, and it can't be representational. And so there is, I think there is something of a mystery, right, on the reading that that I favor. I think, and I think is grounded in the text, as to how that would be explained. We've clearly got a commitment to the fact that we always are aware of these individual acts, and various features of that argument, it seems to me, commit him to the view that it can't be a causal product because he thinks it's necessary. It's always present, and it can't be representational in just the sort of sense that we were talking about, because it's not subject to error, for example, either. And so, yeah, I don't think that he gives or suggests an account of that. I think that's where it runs out. Yeah,
interesting. And but also, but the awareness has to be an awareness of a representation, though, even if it itself is not representational.
I'm rejecting that.
Okay. So it's awareness of the content of the representation.
It's having the content, which would be about objects in the world, or seems to be about objects in the world, when it's actually not.
Right, but what I was asking about was the higher order awareness. It's an awareness of a representation.
Oh, you mean so like...
So he seems committed to the view that we are aware of representations when we have them.
We are aware of the states we're in.
But not the representations.
So are you thinking about a case like lucid dreaming?
Right, that's one example. Right, yeah.
Right. So I'm dreaming and I go, wow.
And Aristotle surprisingly talks about lucid dreaming.
He does, exactly.
He says it's kind of common, actually, which I found surprising.
Yeah. Right, that's right. Yeah, so I think what's going on there is, so the dream itself is, dreaming itself is the active use of these representations, these what he calls phantasmata, which have content and represent objects in the world. And they'll be very complex, and they're obviously involving scenarios and changes over time. That's what they're representing. But I don't think that he thinks that you're aware of the representations as such. You seem to be aware of objects in the external world, except that you're dreaming, so you're not really aware of objects in the external world. But the representations are distinct from the objects you seem to be seeing. Okay, so that's what this paper on the Cartesian theater is about, right?
Right.
What you're saying is, okay, but dreaming is an activity, so that argument we had earlier about consciousness suggests you could be aware that you're dreaming. He certainly thinks that's the case. How does that work? So I would say that you're aware of the activity, but not that you're aware of the representation. So you're aware of the activity, and the activity has a certain content. You're dreaming a specific scenario, and you're aware of that just the same way when you're perceiving, you perceive that you're hearing a bell ring or something like that. And so that awareness, I think, would include at least some of that first order content. But I don't think, and what's more is, I'll just say this, things like dreaming or imagining will be, at least in my view, for Aristotle, examples of, say, visualization. So there'll be some kind of a current activity which involves a seeming awareness of objects. And so you'll be aware of that, and presumably some of the content of that. But you're not aware of the representation in virtue of which you have that content. So that's the big fuss in that recent paper, is all about saying you're mixing two different levels of explanation or of the theory. You're mixing a phenomenological description of the experience with the explanatory account that tells you why you're having that particular phenomenological experience with that particular content. And awareness is directed at this activity at the phenomenological level, I would suggest, in answer to your question.
Right. So yeah, that's interesting. So it's almost like the thing you were saying before about the blood and so forth. You have all these things going on underneath the hood, which generate the phenomenology. And
Right.
that's the level at which the awareness, so that's a personal level almost, if you want to import that kind of Dennettian way of talking. And at the subpersonal level, the thing that explains it is all this other stuff, which is outside of awareness.
Right. But and the crucial thing in that this most recent paper is that when you're giving that second account about what goes on at the subpersonal level, awareness doesn't feature at that in that part of the account. That's how you're exercising, right, the Cartesian ghosts and homunculi and stuff like that, is that awareness belongs to the phenomenological description, or anyway the personal description, right, of what's going on, but not at this subpersonal level. And that does distinguish it from, I think, pretty much almost every other account of Aristotle's theory of memory and dreams, where it seems like it involves images of which we are aware. And by being aware of these images, we have memories or dreams of external objects. And this is saying, no, the subpersonal account involves representations, but not awareness of them. And
right, I see now. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, that's really interesting, because that's a very sophisticated view. If that's the correct reading, which is
it is cool. Right. So the bulk of that paper, I mean, these are all long papers, but the bulk of the paper is trying to say, here's what the texts actually say. And if you're paying attention, if you don't just kind of do broad brushstrokes and gloss over it at a high altitude, to mix metaphors, instead you look at the details of the text. That's actually what the texts are describing. And it's kind of goes, I mean, for those who really like the blow-by-blow descriptions, these papers are saying, just look at the other interpretations. Can we make sense of this phrase? Can we make sense of that phrase? How does that actually work? But my claim is that, actually those kinds of details, though they're very sophisticated, seem to be present in the text. They're best accounted for in this way.
Yeah, no, and I agree that the papers are very careful and go through all the different interpretations, and that's one of the nice things about reading your work. If you like ancient philosophy, that's the way you should do it, is by careful textual analysis, putting the Greek up there and giving just how do we fit this all together? Let's assume
that's it.
He's not. Yeah, that's really nice. So I wonder if, just so generally speaking, we're talking a lot about perception, and so I'm wondering if it would be so clearly. I think you're right. Aristotle doesn't have a sense data view. He's not committed to the Cartesian theater, and he is a kind of representationalist in the sense that we were talking about. But he also is committed to the view, I think. So let me ask you if this is right. To the view that the sensible qualities are properties of the world as we sense them, like the blueness. It's not like the kind that secondary properties that you find in Locke, where it's like, okay, so blue is in our experience, but then out there is something which causes it, and we can call that blue if we want to, but it's not blue. Aristotle's view is the blue is out there on the surface of the objects, right?
That's right.
So is he a kind of naive realist then, or would that be going too far?
Yeah, so I don't think he's a naive realist. I do think he's a direct realist.
Okay.
I think he is committed to realism about perceptible qualities.
Mm-hmm.
I think that he thinks that if you're healthy and at the right distance and all that sort of thing, that you see objects as they are.
Right.
I think his claims about infallibility have to do more with proximal stimuli, but I think that when it comes to distal objects, he thinks that you can get it right, and and the world is the way you see it. So the blue is really out there. I think the difference between my sort of view and, say, an interpretation like Sarah Brody's or Miles Bernier, who've written on this sort of thing, is that they sort of think that it just stops at that naive level. It's just like the blue is out there, and blue does what blue does because it's blue, and it makes you see blue, and there really is no more explanation to be had. And what I do, there's a paper on the reality of color and other perceptible qualities. And that argues that that's not the end of the story for Aristotle. There's all this detail in his treatise on perception in the sense organs, on the De Sensu, that focuses on the quantitative basis or framework for understanding quality spaces. Mm-hmm. So he thinks that not just tones, musical tones, which were widely recognized as functions of ratios or proportions, or were identified even with those proportions, that it's also true about color and about flavor and about odor. And I think he doesn't discuss it, but I think he takes it for granted the same is true about temperatures and about moisture. At least it's not as hard to take that on board. So the really interesting thing about the De Sensu is that he's extending the kind of theory that the Pythagoreans had made widespread about music to other sorts of quality spaces, perceptible quality spaces. He's very explicit that you cannot reduce perceptible qualities to numbers or ratios. So in chapter 4 of the De Sensu, he ridicules Democritus for making arithmetic and geometric properties primary.
Right.
Says that's just wrong, right? The primary qualities are colors and flavors and odors, and things like shape, which he calls common perceptibles, right? Shape and size and so forth. Our understanding of that is parasitic on our understanding of colors and flavors and odors and so forth. So he thinks that they're not secondary qualities at all, they're primary qualities of the object. But that's compatible with having this view that their material basis essentially involves proportions. And so there's a lot of discussion in chapter 3 and chapter 4 and chapter 5 of the De Sensu about the different ratios and how they underlie different perceptible qualities. And I think that's a really fascinating, that's a very sophisticated sort of view. So it's not just that blue is out there, but blue is a certain proportion of certain places. He's going to say light to dark or white to black. But at other places he's going to say it has to do with the proportion of the transparent, a certain material nature. He describes it as a material nature in bodies, the mixture of the transparent with earth, which gives it opacity. And he thinks that that mixture, which would be according to a certain proportion, will give you certain hues in the color spectrum. He doesn't want to reduce it to the numeric ratio, but he thinks that there's an underlying material story, and that underlying material story is relevant to, I think, to his account of what we perceive.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because here, as in some other places, you find them kind of walking the middle between what are usually thought of as diametrically opposed views, because on the one hand, you have the direct realists in the contemporary period, I mean. Yeah. And then on the other hand, you have the representationalists, and they usually battle each other. Like, right. Which is it? And Aristotle seems to be sort of saying both, that we have these representations, but they're also we're directly aware of the objects as they are. And that's not a package of views that you find very often in the contemporary literature, I don't think.
No, right. Well, I mean, the phrase direct realism is so abused, it's hard to know exactly, but I'm taking the view that direct realism is distinct from naive realism. And that what's important about direct realism is one of the most salient things about it is that it's not indirect realism.
Right.
So that it's not, it doesn't involve it doesn't essentially involve awareness of the representation.
Okay. So whereas naive realism is that kind of you're the openness to the property without a representation.
Right. So on this view, direct realism, so naive realism, I assume, would be a form of direct realism.
Right, I see.
But I think that also another form would be a representationalist view. And I've argued against, over the years, I've argued against naive realist readings of Aristotle on this account.
I see. Okay. Because so another word for naive realism might be relationalism, that there's just a relation between you and the property, but that's not mediated by a representation.
That's not mediated by right. So I'm comfortable with there being this direct relation to the object, that perception for Aristotle is object involving. I can take on board all of that, but I think that it is mediated by a representation, not a representation of which you're aware, right? As on the indirect realist view, but by which you're aware of a feature in the world. And it's this more radical claim of the naive realist that it's simply the presence of the object in the act, which is essential to perception, and that it doesn't involve a representation. That's what I'm objecting to.
Right, I see. And then so you're the direct realism is to emphasize there's no veil of perception, as you might find in certain like Lockean views. Although,
so that's exactly right. I have a paper, but it's too drafty to really share. But I read around for a long time and I shelved, and I'm now taking it off the shelf again, called The Veil of Perception, and it's about the history of representationalism. So there are interesting questions about the veil of perception and where does this problem arise, and is it an exclusively modern problem, and the way in which it gives rise to either forms of skepticism or in the early modern and late modern period to idealism. So it's most often brought up by idealists. Berkeley doesn't use the phrase, but you've got the idea there. Hegel very definitely uses it. The poet Shelley uses it. Bradley uses versions of it. T.S. Eliot uses it. I mean, so you just see it. When Russell talks about it in Knowledge by Acquaintance and Knowledge by Description, he's got in mind Bradley and Berkeley. It's idealism he's worried about. So you might think this is just a modern problematic. And what this paper does is it says, actually, if you go backwards chronologically, you can see it very clearly in late antiquity. So you see it very, very clearly in Plotinus, a short essay on memory. A very clear example of it. Another very clear example of it is in Sextus Empiricus, this Pyrrhonist skeptic who has the very example you would expect. He says it's like having a portrait of Socrates and not knowing or having access to Socrates. All you've got are the portraits, right? And there's an interesting question as to like how much further does it go back? Sextus thinks that it at least is present in this lesser known group called the Cyrenaics. I think he's wrong about that, but he sees it there. Plotinus is probably criticizing both Aristotle and the Stoics, who, in my view, are both representationalists. And so there's this interesting historical puzzle, which is in this earlier period, right, at the end of the classical period, the beginning of the Hellenistic period, we've got representationalism. You can even go further. Gorgias has a view like this in the Incoming of Helen. And you can think of this as just being seen as unproblematic. You don't see anything like the veil of perception problem. If you go to later antiquity, in the imperial period, it's just taken for granted that it gives rise to the veil of this. They don't call it the veil of perception, but the same problem about skepticism and so forth. And they take it to be so obvious as to be decisive. Just the way we use the description veil of perception as a damning critique. It's dead on arrival, right? Okay. So the question behind the paper and the reason why I shelved it for many years was, what happens in the history of representationalism that goes from it not being a problem at all to being taken as an obvious and decisive problem?
Right.
And I think that, and before I thought, there just has to be this explanation. There has to be a really good argument. There has to be uncovering some commitment. And once you see the commitment, it's all over. And I shelved the paper for quite a few years. Maybe 10 years I shelved it because I couldn't find an intelligible story that would diagnose the transformation. And I've come to think, actually, the Aristotle and Stoics, they're fine. They're representationalists. It doesn't give rise to the veil of perception problem. They didn't have to be troubled by it. And these later philosophers, skeptics, idealists, and so forth, they think it's a problem because they've got in mind a particular view of representationalism, which these older representationalists are just not committed to at all. And it hinges on precisely that scholastic distinction I was mentioning, which is they take it to be essential to representationalism that you're aware of the representation. And it's by being aware of the representation that you're aware of that's the sense of mediation, the strong sense of mediation by which you're aware of things in the world. And so what's crucial is not just that there's something mediating, but that it's through awareness of this intermediate entity that you're aware of something further. And so there you get the sense of indirectness in that awareness of objects in the world is mediated by awareness of something in between. And I don't think they're committed to that view at all. And what made me take the paper off the shelf was I was talking to one of my colleagues, Rich Thomason, and he was saying to me, he said, "Why do you think that there's this kind of intelligible explanation for this shift?" He says, if you think about the philosophical paradigm shifts in our own lifetime, right, about the causal theory of reference, right, or other, I mean, he came up with a couple of different examples about the status of modal metaphysics and so forth. He said, the fact is those took place almost overnight.
Yeah.
People just kind of went, why do we think that? And they just shrugged and said, no, it looks like we can just go ahead with this other way of doing it,
Yeah, and coin died, that's what happened. And people were like, oh, all right, it's fine now.
Right. So it's like there wasn't going to be a theoretical or intelligible explanation of it. The thing that interested me when he said this to me and the veil fell from my eyes was that the first part of this paper is focused on the imagery of the veil of perception. So I start out the paper by saying, where does this expression come from? Because it has such a grip on us, this model, right? The idea is that instead of representations revealing the world, they cover or occlude it, right? They screen it off.
Right.
And this is really powerful, paradoxical kind of image, right? And then, and you can see this very clearly in Hegel, for example. So one of the earliest examples of the precise metaphor for the same philosophical end that I found is in the Phenomenology of Spirit. And he says in the section of consciousness, right? It's already very sophisticated. He says, if consciousness were to go behind the so-called curtain. So he says so-called curtain, so it's already in the air. Somebody's already been talking about this. But he says, if consciousness were to go behind the so-called curtain, all it would find is itself. Right? So there's this idealist move, right?
Yeah,
already,
big time. Yeah.
Right? The beginning of the 19th century. And so I was really fascinated by this metaphor because it's not in the British authors, the early modern authors, right? You do get one or two cases in Thomas Reid, but for a totally, totally unrelated point. Berkeley talks about the veil of words, but he just means obscurantism. It's just totally different. But there are veils all over the place in 19th and 20th century philosophy, some of them related to a greater extent, some to a lesser extent. There's a whole tradition going back to the Renaissance about the veil of Isis, which is very much involved in early modern science and occult properties and things like this in the investigation of nature. These have all sorts of antecedents. So I was really, I was fascinated by the
the veil of tears too, right?
That's totally different. That's unrelated, right? So this is concerned with veils, curtains, coverings. The veil of Isis is actually her robe or her dress. I mean, that whole thing is about unclothing nature itself. It's taking her clothes off. I mean, this is all really actually wrapped up in the whole imagery of it. It's really fascinating. Pierre Hadot has a very interesting book on the history of it. But the so the idea of veiling is old, and there is stuff in antiquity. There's stuff actually in Plato's Gorgias that's relevant. But what was interesting and what Rich made me aware of is that the power of these metaphors, quite apart from the arguments, the analysis of the argument from illusion, the argument from hallucination, our examination of various premises or presuppositions of these arguments, and whether they're true or not, or when understood in one way or understood in another way. That's all familiar. That's all of our familiar tools, that we use, right, to understand these things. But what the paper had made clear to me, and Rich brought home to me, is the way in which there's more than that going on when we find certain models to be productive, or to kind of close off progress. And this is a clear example of that. I think that in late antiquity, Sextus and Plotinus reject the representationalism of the Aristotle and the Stoics on not frivolous grounds, but mistaken grounds. They conceive of it in a very specific way, and there's no reason to think that either Aristotle or the Stoics have those commitments. And I think it really took until the 20th century before representationalism was rehabilitated, where people could say it doesn't require that, right? You can just be thinking about the properties which are content bearing, right, and which enable us to have personal mental states about objects in the world.
Right. Yeah, that's so fascinating. So you don't think that you find something like this in Democritus or in maybe even Parmenides? That kind of screening off or veil. So, the idea that, by convention sweet, by convention hot, everything else, atoms in the void, or that's not, you don't think that kind of view can be imported to them?
So you do get skepticism earlier on. That's absolutely right. And you do get interest in illusions and hallucinations from early on. So that's completely correct as well. But I take it that what's distinctive about the veil of perception set of issues is that we take the very means by which we were supposed to grasp the world to be the source of the problem themselves.
I see.
That it's precisely them that block off or screen the world. The idea that knowledge is difficult or things occlude our vision or, and so forth, that's just a general problem about, what do we have knowledge of and what do we not have knowledge of? But the idea that the very thing that was supposed to enable us prevents us is what makes that so gripping.
I guess the reason, because there's like fragments of Democritus that sort of suggest something like that, where he says, the reason overturns the senses, and the senses sort of say back, by what right do you overturn us? We're like the source of everything, or something.
Absolutely right. And Xenophanes talks about there being that everything is wrought over with seeming, right? That there's appearance, right? But not getting access to reality itself. And I think that early academic skeptics like Arcesilaus really look back to this earlier tradition about the senses deceiving us and illusion and appearance, and draw a lot from that. And I think I discuss them in this paper as well. I think that, Arcesilaus actually, it's funny, he actually interprets an early line in Hesiod as, he has a different reading of it. I think he's probably punning rather than reading a different text, but he sees Hesiod as, in a way, kind of in this whole tradition. I think that the academics are actually right, that there is this strand of the tradition, but a lot of that is worries about how difficult knowledge is, the ways in which we go astray, and how the senses, though we rely on them, are not really reliable.
Right.
None of that involves this radical kind of that it's perverse in its very roots. So here's an example of something early. It doesn't have to do with epistemology, it has to do with ethics. But at the end of the Gorgias, in the eschatological section about the afterlife, Socrates says, this is Plato's Gorgias. Socrates says, we can't have true justice on earth because we have embodied souls judging other embodied souls. And our eyes and our ears deceive us about the nature of the souls that we see. And it's only when we have disembodied souls, he says, one naked soul judging another naked soul, where they can see the true content of their character, that we would have true justice. And now that's about ethical qualities, right, rather than perceptible qualities. But there the idea is that our eyes and ears don't reveal, they occlude they prevent us. That it's not that you could get, if you could only get a better view, if I viewed in the right conditions, I'd get it right. It's that there's no way to see things correctly with the organs of sight.
Yeah.
Right? You have to see in some other way through the soul.
Right. And so that's what that thing you were mentioning earlier, that there's a strand of this in Plato, that would be where it'd be. Yeah.
And there's an antecedent in Homer too. So I think it's in book 5 where one of the warriors has the mist that covers mortals' eyes is lifted, and he can suddenly see which warriors on the battlefield are gods and which ones are men. But otherwise, our eyes hide that from us. So our eyes don't allow us to see correctly, but they make us blind to these differences. And it's that paradoxical quality that I think is really that underlies the real veil of perception worry.
Yeah, and I see. Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm looking forward to this paper coming out. I'm glad you took it off the shelf, actually.
Yeah. Well, we'll see.
Okay. Well, I notice we're getting on in time. I can't keep you forever, and my son's getting home from school here in a second. So I wonder, we've talked about a lot, but I wonder if there's anything that you were hoping would come up or expecting would come up that hasn't come up. And the answer could be no, because I know you have a lot. But if you feel like there's something you wanted to talk about, I'd like to make sure.
No, I think we covered quite a range, and certainly with regard to my work. I mean, I think one thing I will say, this came up. I'll just mention it briefly. I'll try to be brief. That when I was in China in November before the virus hit, and I was challenged in Beijing about what was the value of doing the history of philosophy here. It seems like the takeaway lessons that we could get from some of these discussions could be stated very simply. You could, as it were, throw away the ladder. Having ascended the ladder, you kick it away. You don't really need it. And I think it's true that we can recover insights from the history or discover ones that we haven't really thought of and need to pay more attention to. I mentioned that before. That's the kind of utilitarian justification that, for example, a former colleague of mine, Rod Chisholm, used to use. I mean, he started every morning, apparently, reading 15 minutes of Aquinas in Latin just to warm up,
Wow.
And his view was, you just raid the history of philosophy for good ideas, and sometimes you find them and sometimes you don't, and you take whatever you can get. And I think there's something to that, and I think there's something to what I described at the beginning in terms of this parallax, this conceptual parallax of getting a different perspective on things, from seeing it from a different horizon or different theoretical vantage point. But I also think that there's something really valuable in that historians of philosophy do that's actually essential to philosophy quite generally, but non-historians don't always do as much of, or are not as conscious of the issues methodologically. And that's the extent to which, in addition to analysis and logical argumentation, in addition even to what I was just describing about metaphors and models and images, is the practice of interpretation.
Yeah.
So historians are primarily occupied. I mean, their starting point is always textual, is how do we make sense of this text? It's puzzling, it's problematic. I can't reconcile this bit with that bit. Do I have the resources in the text to make sense of it? is there any conjecture I can make that would make it not necessarily true? I mean, it's not Davidson's principle of charity, right? At all. It's rather, can I just make it intelligible, right? Can I make it coherent to myself that a smart person at another time with maybe different beliefs thought this was really pretty compelling and that I should consider it, right? That's the level of charity I'm at.
Yeah.
And historians of philosophy, I think, are really well practiced in seeing how something might just seem superficially obvious, like an interpretation, a reading might seem like the only one you could do. But when you're in groups or you're in seminars in the history of philosophy, you suddenly realize that the text is much more open than you realize, and that there are very subtle differences or emphases which allow you to read the very same text in very, very disparate ways. And one of the things that struck me while I was having this conversation in Beijing was that actually this is true about philosophy quite generally, that a lot of times your contemporaries that you're arguing with or disputing with are not people that you're in touch with. And even when you can call them up or Zoom with them or email them, those interactions don't necessarily shine more light on what they said and what's going on, you know, because they don't always have the same kind of grasp of what they're doing that a third person does looking at it. And it struck me that actually, even with living, you know, you could think, well, with the history of philosophy, the problem or the advantage is that these people are dead and you can't talk to them. But it struck me that actually it's the other way around, that even with living people who you can talk with, it's not necessarily going to get you, you're not going to make the progress you need, the insights that you need. And what it made clear to me is a different reason why the history of philosophy is, I think, essential to the training of any philosopher, which is that in reading and in talking with other philosophers and arguing with them, an absolutely essential, fundamental part of our toolkit is our ability to interpret and see different ways of interpreting what other people are saying. Not just, again, in Davidson's sense of making it all come out true or as much of it as you can, right? But in the sense of just making it intelligible, and that there are very different ways of taking very similar formulations and understanding wildly different sorts of schemes. And so I think that one of the great things about training students in the history of philosophy who are not going to be historians is not only acquainting them with a tradition which is responsible for the problems that they've inherited and are dealing with, but also for getting them how to learn sophisticated ways, illuminating ways of reading other philosophers, especially when you're handicapped by not being able to get in touch with them, right? It forces you back on your own resources to imagine other points of view, to see ways of defending another point of view, to think about the ways of testing it or putting pressure on it and so forth. And that this is just a central philosophical activity that we use quite widely, in addition to very important analytical, logical techniques, and imaginative techniques as well. So I just wanted to put in a plug.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, I tell my students all the time, it's really easy to tear things down. It's a lot harder to say, why would an intelligent person say something that I don't agree with? And trying to work your way into their point of view and say, why this they thought was really important. And so how do you put it all together so that we make the most sense of them? It's like the principle of honorable charity or something. It's not like you want to make it true. You want to treat them as a reasoner that has certain capacities.
That's right. The charity is to see it as intelligible, right, to a smart person, that the smart person would find worthy of belief, or worthy of consideration.
And I couldn't agree with you more. That's important for doing philosophy generally, and for, I'd say, just being a citizen as well, by the way, in our current climate. But,
well, isn't that true?
Yes.
We've learned that lesson pretty well.
Yeah, exactly. Well, on that note, I want to thank you for joining me today, Victor. And I really enjoyed this conversation. I learned a tremendous amount from your work, and I hope that, that people engage with it. And I'll put the links up, like I said. And just hang out for a second. I'll say bye off the air. But thanks again. I
Okay.
really appreciate it.
Thanks so much. I appreciate it.
Okay, we're done. We're